I spent 2 years preparing this surprise. 2 years. I meticulously gathered everything about our perfect vacation. I started with the simplest of things, picking a place he'd always wanted to see, but never really talked about. Then came the more complicated stuff: hotels, restaurants, excursions. I created a file folder, filling it with travel guides, maps, lists of places that would be perfect for us. I thought he would love it. It was a gift I had been preparing for so long. After all, he loved traveling, and I loved making him happy. Every day as I checked hotel reservations and mapped out itineraries, I saw these details add up to the big picture. Our big picture. I worked overtime, spent evenings at the computer gathering information, reading reviews, calling places, and figuring out which ones were a good fit. I even gave up a few get-togethers with friends because I was sure that if everything was perfect, this moment would be something truly important to both of us. I set aside money, snatched up every spare moment to finalize it. That was my skill, building memories that we would keep in our hearts for years to come. I didn't realize that I was actually building a memory for 2 people, one of whom was not me. I couldn't get it into my head how I was so unable to see it all. But after all, he'd always said he didn't like surprises, didn't like being forced to do something unexpected. I didn't know how to arrange it, so I didn't tell him about the trip until a week before it started. I held the envelope in my hand, knowing for sure that his reaction would startle me. After all, he'd always been like that, sometimes too calm, and I'd always felt like he didn't really realize how much I was doing for him. But when I handed him that reservation, when he printed it out and his face blurred in surprise, I realized he hadn't expected it. He said to me, "You did this for me?" With surprise, with sincerity, with genuine amazement. And like a fool, I just nodded and smiled, thinking that I had finally done something important. He hugged me tightly and told me it was the most beautiful thing he had ever been given. It was a moment I will forever cherish in my memory. I also felt a slight unease because I never knew how to properly respond to his praise. He looked at me like I was a miracle, and I was proud that he was so happy. But not a few days later, his look changed. 3 days before our trip, he suddenly said he couldn't go. Work stuff, urgent tasks, all the excuses I had heard before, but with that look on his face as if I meant nothing. I didn't ask what the business was, even though it was important to me. I didn't try to find out what had happened. I just stayed in the shadows like I always did. It was the moment when something broke. He was annoyed when I asked what the deal was. He started accusing me of being too controlling, too insistent. I immediately apologized, as I always do, and suggested to him that he stay home and I go alone. He looked at me in surprise and said, "Well, drive then." Like a challenge. But despite all this, I realized that he had no right to cancel my plans. I agreed again. He said I was worrying too much and maybe I should think about what I was making up for myself. I put it all aside. It was a moment when I thought that maybe I just needed to trust him. My whole life at that point had come down to making him happy, but I couldn't risk it anymore. A few hours before I was supposed to leave, I quietly canceled my vacation and left him a small gift set: sunscreen, perfume, a note with our jokes and memories. I left it on his desk as a casual goodbye. My chest clenched hard as I watched me pack my suitcase alone while he sat on the couch, not noticing anything. I walked home, deciding that maybe he was right, that he had urgent business to attend to. Still, I tried not to check my phone, but I couldn't, and when I turned it on, I had to stop. It was like that moment in the movie when the main character finds something she didn't even know she had. Her heart clenches. It was like in that moment, everything that was important disappeared. I saw her, Mia, his ex. She was with him, and the photo I saw was taken at the very resort I'd booked. The palm trees, the pool, the view from the balcony I'd booked. Everything was exactly as I had prepared for us. I felt my stomach clench. It was painful. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was all an accident. Maybe they weren't. They're together? But the next photo was of him, and he looked as happy as he had when we first started dating. In that moment, I realized that my whole life, all my efforts were for someone else. I felt my world crumbling. It was a strange feeling, as if I was suddenly on some alien island with no people and no meaning. I sat in complete silence, turning off my phone and immersed in the abyss of my own thoughts. I tried to understand what had happened, but as soon as my eyes returned to those pictures, to that distinct view of the resort, I realized that everything I had built, all my dreams, my plans, my efforts, had been stolen. He had taken everything I had created and given it to her. I didn't get angry, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just sat there, feeling emptiness, and strangely, some strange gratitude. Yes, gratitude, because now I knew it was over. I didn't shed tears, didn't try to figure out why it was so. I didn't need to. I just began to look at it as a completed chapter to be put behind me. I knew my life was going to be different. I wasn't going to stay in the shadows or be insignificant. I turned on my laptop, sat down, and opened the blocked email, a job offer I had put off months ago. It was a job opening at an international hotel chain, a management position. The moment I first saw the offer, I had decided that I could never leave, that I would be with him, that I would support him. But now, with the feeling of being stripped of all my emotions, with a cold decision inside, I chose to answer. I'm interested. When can I start? I wrote. The answer came an hour later. I was offered a location that I was to go to soon, with full coverage, temporary housing, and many benefits. In that moment, I felt a solid sense of relief and freedom come over me with every word I read. This was a chance to not just start a new phase in my life, but to start from scratch, without looking back at what I had left behind. I chose Bali, and as strange as it sounds, I couldn't help but smile. At that moment, I didn't even realize that in Bali, he would be with her. At that point, I didn't care. I was packing up my life, and it was mine, not someone else's. I quietly packed my bags, not paying attention to what I was leaving behind. I felt like none of it mattered. The moment I left my apartment, I realized this was the moment I had decided my own fate. I didn't try to prove anything to Ethan. I didn't try to get him to see me. I just walked out without saying a word. As I left, I could feel all traces of my dependence on him slowly disappearing. 3 days later, I was in a hotel in Bali. I didn't want to think about him. I didn't want to think about her. All I wanted to do was work. I began to immerse myself in my duties, improving service, implementing new standards for guests. The resort I worked at was far from anything I had once known. Here I could be myself, could quietly do my job and not worry about what was going on behind the doors. But of course, he still tried to reach out. He sent a few messages asking how I was and saying he still didn't understand what had happened. I didn't respond. My feelings for him were gone, and there was no point in getting hurt again. A few days passed and I felt calm. I even began to enjoy the feeling of no longer waiting, of not hoping for something to happen. I didn't want to see him, and I wasn't going to talk to him. He wrote that he was very worried, that he didn't realize how he had ruined everything I had done for him. He tried to apologize, explaining that his trip with Mia was a mistake, an accident, but I wasn't listening anymore. Everything he said didn't matter. It was just empty words. In that moment, I decided I didn't want to carry the weight of this story anymore. I didn't need his excuses and explanations. Instead, I began to look at my work and myself with pride. I gave myself to a cause that I was truly interested in, and I felt the confidence growing inside of me. I no longer needed to justify my actions to anyone. My life belonged only to me, and now I would be in control of every step. On the first day, I didn't give myself a moment for doubt. I didn't regret leaving everything behind. I didn't worry. I didn't try to find excuses for leaving. My thoughts were clear and focused. I arrived at work and immediately plunged into things. The resort I found myself at was a utopia. Everything was perfectly organized, uncluttered, and uncomplicated. I loved the place. The local staff treated every guest with respect, and I felt like I could do something significant here. It was an opportunity to be myself without being distracted by empty worries about the past. I managed, supervised, implemented new standards, and was pleased with the results. I have always dreamed of a job where every day brings results, where you can realize your ideas. And here I am, in Bali, surrounded by all those things, which eventually became mine. It was my choice, my path, and I didn't regret it. Against this backdrop, even Bali itself became somehow secondary. The most important thought that haunted me was that all these places I had once planned for him and me had become part of my new life. And let him be there with her. Let their attention be focused on what he and I hadn't done. I didn't care. I didn't feel resentment. I didn't feel revenge. There was just an emptiness that was slowly fading away. And it wasn't pain, but rather a release. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it, but it was definitely the right thing to do. I didn't try to find it. My thoughts didn't revolve around him. Ethan was just a part of my story, a part of the life I'd left behind. The whole thing, from the moment I went to Bali, was like a page I'd just turned and thrown away. It wasn't until a few days later that I heard his name again. I was sitting in my office going through paperwork when I was informed that he had tried to call. At that moment, I felt mildly irritated. I didn't want to hear his voice again. I didn't want to go back to what I'd left behind. But still, despite my efforts not to react, I felt his presence still affected me. He texted, saying he didn't understand what had happened, that he wanted to talk. But I knew there was nothing left to talk about. I decided that I needed to keep moving forward. When he sent another text, I thought I'd had enough of his explanation. I wasn't going to stop, and his words, like all his excuses, had no power. He wasn't important anymore. I wasn't doing what I usually did. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't check his profiles. I was just living the life I wanted to live. And that's when I realized that all my feelings were now pure, from him. My world was empty, but in this empty world, it was just me and my own dreams. A few more days passed, and I could feel the weight slowly lifting off my shoulders. I no longer worried about his attempts to connect, no longer felt anxious when he texted again and again, apologizing, asking for explanations. I didn't respond. He continued to be a part of the past. At some point, when I once again refused to talk to him, I decided it was time to take the next step. After all, I needed to act the way I had always wanted to act. I was ready to start building not only my career, but a life without him. And when I came across this job offer, I realized that now that I would not have him in my life, I could truly be myself. I decided not to hesitate with this offer. The decision was made, but there was no room for regret here. I didn't regret his apology. I didn't regret the fact that I couldn't have him back anymore. I just moved on. I didn't even try to look for truth in his words. They didn't matter. I didn't need to know why he did what he did. I didn't need to find out why he didn't appreciate what I had done for him. I needed to deal with myself now. I accepted it as a fact, as one of those things that you can never fix, but that you just have to let go. And so in that process of letting go, I began to feel a part of me coming back. I was ready for a new life, a new perspective. And the more I thought about it, the less I cared about Ethan and his regrets and his explanations. It became a clear and distinct decision. I was ready to put it behind me. I decided that I would build my life around what was important to me. And it wasn't about him, it was about me. I knew that if I continued to stay in the shadows and in silence, nothing would change. I couldn't allow myself to worry about what he might have thought of me. He probably thought I was just a temporary element in his life, something unimportant that could easily be replaced. And maybe that was true for him. But to me, this story meant so much more. I couldn't go back to being the person who constantly forgives, forgets, and sacrifices for someone else. I no longer wanted to be in a secondary role in someone else's life. This was the moment when I realized that the time for change was now. I wasn't going to make excuses for my feelings or my actions. I was no longer going to suffer alone and wait for someone to change their attitude towards me. I had learned a long time ago that if you want to achieve something, you have to act, not wait for approval. And I was ready for it. I accepted the way things were, but I was no longer letting the past determine my future. I didn't need his answers, his apologies, or his confessions. It was all meaningless. When I finally made my decision, I felt my life fill with energy that I had spent on something valuable, myself. I wasn't just that girl who was waiting for someone to love and care for her. I became a woman who started to build her own destiny, and that process was long and required effort. I had to learn to stop looking back, to stop looking for some hidden meanings in every word. I had to become strong, and I was becoming strong. It wasn't easy, but eventually I realized that it was the only way I could find my strength. I didn't need his acceptance anymore. Every morning I woke up, and the day was a new chance for me. I was ready to work, to build, to create. I was certain that my life would now be mine alone. In a way, I even felt grateful that all of this had happened. After all, through his actions, I had discovered a new world, a new perspective on life, my worth, and my ability to be happy regardless of what was going on with him. I was ready for new challenges and opportunities. When I started my job at the hotel, it became clear to me how much I could accomplish if I would only listen to myself and not be distracted by the past. People began to notice the changes. I could feel my confidence growing, how I was getting better at what I was doing, and how important it was to stay honest with myself. I was no longer trying to please those around me or justify my actions. I just worked, genuinely enjoying the process. Each day brought me a sense of fulfillment, and I began to realize that my real strength lay in not being afraid to be myself. But Ethan, despite my efforts to ignore him, kept trying to connect with me. He texted me, he called me, and I could feel his messages starting to annoy me. All of his words seemed empty and meaningless. He apologized, said he wanted to make things right, that he had a different outlook on life now, but I didn't care. I couldn't believe those words. Anything he could have said to me didn't matter. I had already made up my mind. He was part of my past, and I wasn't going to put him back there. He wasn't in my new life, and I wasn't going to let him back in. When I took it calmly, I realized that I didn't need to prove anything else. I was already on my way to my goal, and his presence couldn't change who I had become or what I had accomplished. I was no longer dependent on his confessions, his apologies, his outlook on life. I was free. It was the moment I realized that I had to be strong, not just for myself, but for everything I wanted to create. And he, Ethan, could stay in the past. A few weeks passed, and life in Bali began to take its toll. I plunged headfirst into my work, feeling neither heavy nor tired. My body got used to this new rhythm. In the mornings, I walked on the beach, feeling the sea breeze filling me with fresh energy, and at night, I sat at my desk in my new office, reviewing reports and working closely with the team. Everything was set up for success, and I was ready for it. Striving to improve every aspect of the job gave me true satisfaction. Each day, I became more confident in my actions and the decisions I made. It was like an initial leap when you break out of your comfort zone and start doing things in your own unique way, rather than following a template. I could feel the space I was occupying start to grow. I wasn't just Ethan's girl anymore. I was a self-sufficient woman who was creating my future, my reality. All of the changes I was implementing began to yield results. The hotel started receiving more positive reviews, the staff was more motivated, and the guests were happier. This was confirmation that I was on the right track. I began to enjoy every day, absorbing all these moments. Even walking around the hotel garden began to bring me joy. My thoughts didn't go back to what had happened with him. It was all in the past. But one day, at the end of the week, as I sat in my office going over plans for the next few months, I received a text message. At first, I didn't pay attention to it, thinking it was just another request from some new client. But when I saw a name that gave me a strange feeling, my heart clenched. It was Ethan. He was trying to get in touch again. His words popped up on the screen. "I thought you had already forgiven everything. Why are you leaving us?" I closed the screen, taking a deep breath. Those words had no meaning, no power. They were empty. I felt I needed to be strong in this moment. It was a choice I had made a long time ago. I wasn't willing to let these messages take me back in time. I didn't want to relive again those moments when I felt like I depended on his acceptance. I did everything I could to not give him a place in my life, and yet his words kept appearing like intrusive shadows that I didn't want to give my strength to. With each message he sent, I found it harder and harder to keep my distance. It was a challenge I hadn't expected, but it made me realize how important it was to be steadfast. I wasn't going to respond, but this irritation I felt was pushing me to act. I'm not going to let him manipulate my feelings. I won't let him back into my life that had been centered on him for so long. I had already given him everything I could, but now it's time to take a step in the other direction. He wrote that he missed me, that he didn't understand why I did what I did. He made excuses for his mistakes, but I didn't want to hear those words anymore. I remembered that moment when he told me that the trip was an accident. It was a lie, and I realized that nothing could change that. He was my past, and I wasn't going to be the one to save him from his own decisions. But despite everything I felt, I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. I started to worry that maybe he really did love me, that this was his way of dealing with the situation. But I realized that this was only giving me illusions. He wasn't going to change, and I wasn't going to become that forgive and forget person again. My future didn't depend on his apology. That evening, after I received another text from Ethan, I made a decision. I couldn't waste any more time looking for meaning in his words. I had to focus on myself, my growth, and my goals. I took my phone, erased his number, and blocked it. This was the step I had been waiting for. It was getting rid of everything that was keeping me from moving forward. I felt relieved, but maybe a little sad that I couldn't just let him go forever. I looked at my phone, the screen no longer showing his messages. It was like a cleansing. I wasn't letting his presence take up space in my life. I was free, and that feeling of freedom felt so good that I realized how little I needed to be happy. From the moment I blocked Ethan out, I felt like my life was finally getting back to normal. I didn't expect things to be easy, but as I immersed myself in my work, the energy that used to go into worry and doubt was now channeled into a more productive direction. I no longer felt his shadow haunting me. I was training the team, implementing new standards, changing the system, improving the quality of service. But more importantly, I taught myself to be confident in my decisions, regardless of what had happened in the past. I was fully committed to my work, and although memories of the past sometimes popped into my head, of the way he looked at me when I did things for him, I no longer needed his approval. I was getting stronger every day. It was like a long-awaited release, like air that finally filled my lungs. I was no longer dependent on his evaluations and decisions. But one evening, as I sat in my room answering emails, a staff member walked into the office with new guest requests. I glanced at the list and noticed that a new name had appeared among the reservations: Ethan. For a second, I felt my heart clench, but I quickly drove the thoughts away. He was in the past, and I was ready to say goodbye to him. He probably thought he was coming back, but to me, he was no longer the man I had once made plans for. This visit was none of my business, and I wasn't going to interfere. I simply directed him to the room that had been pre-booked for him without much emotion. After all, I didn't even need to even ask him about his time anymore. I had put it all behind me. When I thought about it, I realized that at some point I had learned to let go, and he, despite his best efforts, had never been able to get me back. The next day, I met with the director discussing possible improvements for next season. There was a lot of work to do, and once again I felt this moment bringing me back to what I should be doing. I couldn't afford any distractions. Guests started leaving great reviews, many remarking on the high level of service, coziness, and attention to detail. In the evening, I strolled around the hotel grounds, feeling the warmth of the sun pleasantly touching my skin. At that moment, I finally realized that everything I had been building was now bearing fruit. My life was in my hands, and I could now control it. A month went by, and I began to feel that this job was a real challenge for me. I wasn't just building a career, I was building my life by my own rules. I was no longer afraid to make mistakes. I learned to be confident and make all decisions on my own without looking to anyone else. These were my accomplishments, and I was proud of it. As I walked along the beach, the evening shadows lay on the sand, and I felt strong. I realized that I was not only a professional, but a person who was no longer afraid to build a life without looking back at the mistakes of the past. I couldn't remember the last time I thought that Ethan and his apology had ever mattered. At one point, I even started laughing. It was so stupid to worry about a man who couldn't appreciate your sincerity, and now I was ready to move on. One morning, waking up early, I felt a memory come over me. It was strange, not painful, but the realization that I no longer had Ethan in my life seemed to come to me at that moment as the first rays of sunlight came through the window. He was here, in my past, but I no longer felt the disappointment that had haunted me before. I was now liberated. At first, it had been hard for me to come back to myself, but now, months later, I could feel his shadow fading away. I got out of bed and headed for the window. The morning light, soft and gentle, filled the room. I could see the ocean on the horizon, swaying peacefully to the rhythm of the tide. I stretched and felt my body relax, as if all the tension of the last few months was dissolving into this moment. It wasn't goodbye, it was a release. I was no longer the woman who waited for his decision, his attention, his love. I was me. I was who I was always meant to be. The first weeks in this place had been difficult, but now I felt strong and confident. This was the moment I realized that I really could do anything I wanted. I will no longer look toward the past. I would no longer search for answers to questions that had long since lost their relevance. And as I went to work, once again immersed in my current affairs, I felt my life become meaningful again. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer looking for excuses for what had happened. I had accepted it, and now I was moving on. The work was coming together. Everything around me was changing. The service was improving, guests were leaving positive feedback, the team was becoming more united. It became easier for me to manage, and most importantly, I stopped worrying. Everything I did was right. And at some point, it became obvious to me that I had accomplished everything I had set out to do. I had control over my life, and it was an incredibly satisfying feeling. I felt no sadness, no regret for what I had lost. I knew it was the right path. And then one day, I got his letter. Ethan had written to me again, and I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. He asked to see me. He said he had realized a lot, and now he knew what he had lost. I looked at the screen and thought, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. His words sounded familiar, like another set of excuses that couldn't change what was already there. I closed the email, but his request continued to echo in my head. I didn't want to date him. He didn't deserve it. A few days later, after I ignored his request, I felt like I needed to clear things up for myself. The scene of him trying to win me back, how he looked for ways to convince me over and over again that his feelings were real, played over and over again in my head. But I was stronger than that. I wasn't worried about his attempts anymore. He wasn't a part of my life, and I wasn't going to bring him back into it. But still, at some point, I was curious about what he wanted so insistently. At that time, I received another letter from his mother. She wrote that she was worried about him and that perhaps I should talk to him if I felt I could. I read her letter and felt no anger or resentment. She was not to blame for his mistakes. She had always been a good and caring woman, and I remembered all her kind words. But that didn't matter now. I didn't have to justify his behavior. I had to live for myself. I didn't answer his mother's letter because I didn't see the point. He was a grown man, and he had to take responsibility for his actions on his own. I didn't want to revisit that painful past again. I wasn't going to be the one to help him deal with the consequences of his mistakes. That was his choice, and I had already made mine. In that moment, I could feel myself becoming strong again. This whole situation with him trying to get me back, was like water that couldn't outshine the sun. I was ready to move on, and I knew for a fact that he would no longer be a part of my journey. He could stay in the past, and I would build a future free of him. I didn't respond to Ethan and his mother's messages, though at times their words wrapped around in my head like mercury. Hard to catch and hold, but you can still feel them moving. I couldn't understand what they wanted from me. What was he hoping to get from me? I couldn't go back to being the woman who forgave everything. He expected me to open the door to him again, to let him in and give him a chance. But I had already closed it firmly. I had closed it, and I wasn't going to give him the keys back. I've been thinking a lot about what forgiveness means. I'd learned to forgive myself, my mistakes, my weaknesses. And now I realize that forgiveness is not about bringing someone back into your life. Forgiveness was about releasing a weight I no longer wanted to carry. It was a step that required strength, but provided incredible relief. I could no longer allow my heart to take up space for those who didn't appreciate it. I had set myself free. Work left me no time to worry. I felt again that I had control over not only my time, but my life. Each new project I started gave me even more confidence. I realized that my life could only be filled with those who truly valued me, who were willing to share it with me, not those who only took without giving anything in return. Ethan was only a memory, and I was teaching myself to live for myself. One evening, as I walked along the beach, a thought occurred to me. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to stay in the shadow of his apologies and attempts to win me back. I had come to a decision. I needed to move on and live my life without looking back. This wasn't revenge, it was forgiveness. And I realized that I needed to learn to finally let go. And I did, deciding that I would no longer think about him, no longer live the memories that were holding me back. Over the next few days, I felt strength and confidence fill me. It was like a cleansing, like a fresh start. I no longer worried about what I had lost. I realized that I hadn't lost anything. I had gained freedom. Freedom to be myself. Freedom to not respond to messages I didn't need. And in that, I felt empowered. I continued to live my life without the distraction of Ethan. He was nothing more than a ghost from the past, but I wondered how he would react to my rejection. At first, I thought he'd probably come back and try again and again to get my attention. But with each passing day, I felt his attempts were becoming more and more futile, and I knew that despite everything, I wouldn't go back to the way things were. A few months passed, and I had to return. Home on business, after all, back to where this whole story began. It was like returning to the battlefield, but now I only had one chance, not to look back at what had gone before. I felt the cold wind touch my skin, and in that moment I realized that there would be no apologies or forgiveness in my life. I was ready to be me and move forward. As soon as I got back, I had to face him. I heard he was in town, but I didn't want to see him. Still, I realized that we would be bound to cross paths at some point. He had to realize, too, that this chapter in our lives was over. I didn't need his forgiveness. I didn't need his explanation. I had already gotten past all of this and freed myself from his presence. When I arrived at the cafe where we were supposed to meet, I felt my heart beat steady, calm. It wasn't irritation, not anxiety, but rather a sense of a closed loop that no longer mattered. I knew he hadn't come to apologize. He just wanted to see me, to see how I was, and I knew it didn't matter to me. I sat down across from him, and though he spoke some words, they had no power. He was saying that he realized all his mistakes, that he'd lost me, that he should never have done that, but I wasn't listening anymore. I just looked at him and realized that I wasn't going back to that past. I'm not reliving it. I'm not suffering. I calmly told him I couldn't be with him anymore, and even though his eyes filled with tears, I felt calm. It was closure, and I accepted it. After seeing Ethan, I felt the inner tension leave me. His words, full of remorse and regret, no longer made me anxious. I felt no resentment, no desire to put things back the way they were. It was a release, as if I was finally letting go of everything that held me back in the past. I was no longer letting him control my feelings. My life was now my choice, and mine alone. I was no longer dependent on his presence or absence. A few weeks passed, and I gradually returned to my normal life, full of work, meetings, and new ideas. Working at the hotel was becoming more and more successful, and I could feel my career going uphill. The hotel gained new high ratings, and more guests were looking to stay with us. I watched my project grow. The staff became more and more motivated, and the flow of positive feedback never stopped. It was the satisfaction of knowing that I had created something meaningful, and I began to realize that real value is not in being tied to the past, but in making the future better. But every time I thought my life was becoming calm and predictable, I felt a new challenge looming on the horizon. The hotel management offered me an expansion. The management offered me a new role, with more responsibilities and opportunities for growth. It was an exciting offer, and I felt it was the moment when I could finally establish myself in my new life. I decided to accept the offer, knowing that it would be a meaningful step forward. I felt confident in my decision. This was a new phase, a new chance that I deserved. And so, as I began to get used to my new responsibilities, as I began to feel like my life belonged to me again, I suddenly received a message that made me freeze for a moment. It was an email from Ethan. He was trying to make contact again. I sat down at my desk and opened it. He wrote that he'd realized everything, that he was sorry for what he'd lost, and that he now realized how much I meant to him. He wanted to meet, to talk. But I felt everything I'd worked so hard to build was eclipsed inside me. His words were already empty, insignificant. I couldn't afford to go down the same path again. I closed his letter again and felt something important happen inside me. In that moment, sitting in my office, surrounded by papers and plans, I realized that I didn't want to see him anymore. He was not a part of my life. I was sure of it. I couldn't give him the chance to ruin everything I'd built for myself again. It was hard, but I knew it was the right choice. I didn't want to go back to those times when I doubted myself, when I looked to him for justification. I'd already been down that road, and I wasn't going to go back to that old crossroads where I chose him over myself. I got home late that night, and as always, I wanted some privacy. I sat down on the balcony and looked up at the night sky, feeling the stars twinkle in the distance. I didn't think about the past. I wasn't thinking about what he might say to me, how he might try to win me back. I thought about myself, about how much I had gone through to become the person I was now. I realized that I wouldn't regret not seeing him again. I didn't have to search for answers to questions that hadn't made sense a long time ago. I was free. Every day I felt more and more how important it was to be true to myself, to not look back, to not look for validation of my feelings in other people. I began to realize again that real success is when you can be independent, when you make your own destiny. I was no longer dependent on confessions and apologies. I wasn't the woman who waited. I was a woman who moved forward no matter what. And with that feeling of confidence, I knew my choice was the right one. Ethan's letter was just a reminder of how much I had accomplished, how much I had come through, and I realized that there was no room for regret for me. Now, not his regrets, not mine. I was ready to start on a new path, and that path had nothing to do with what I had once experienced. It was mine alone. I didn't expect to feel so confident when the time came to accept my new role. I accepted it not as an obligation, but as a chance to show myself and those around me that I could do more than just follow other people's expectations. I became the person who now determined my own destiny. It was the first step to becoming a leader in the full sense of the word. Working at the hotel began to bring me joy. I didn't just follow processes, I managed them, creating an atmosphere that was harmonious and productive for everyone. The hotel was becoming more successful every day. My confidence was growing, and I could feel how this success was not just reflected in numbers and reports, but in how I felt about my life. I no longer expected someone else to help me change anything in my journey. I was the captain of my own ship, and now I was confidently heading in the direction I had chosen for myself. And so, when I felt that I had already found stability and order in my life, a new idea came to me. I decided that I wanted to expand my business. This resort became not only a place for vacation, but also a platform for new opportunities, new projects. I started thinking about creating new hotel chains, new innovative business approaches. I set new goals for myself because now I saw that I could do anything I wanted. This new energy that was flowing through me filled me with confidence, and I couldn't afford to stop. But just when I thought things had gotten better in my life, a moment came again that reminded me of the past. In one of the reports, I noticed a strange piece of information. There was a new project on the resort, network that was very similar to what I had done before. It was some new direction, and I felt a strange uneasiness sweep over me. I couldn't figure out what exactly was causing me to have this reaction. Maybe it was the challenge, or maybe I just didn't expect anyone to be watching my steps, but something about this project felt familiar to me. I soon found out that this new project was related to a company that had once offered me a partnership. It was strange because I remembered how long ago I had declined their offer. Now they approached me again, and I realized that despite my independence, this situation had my attention. At some point, I felt it became not just a project, but something important, something that could change my path. Every day it became clearer to me that my life could take a completely different path. This project wasn't just a challenge, it was a chance I couldn't pass up. I could feel the old fears and doubts slowly fading away, giving way to something more important. I was ready for new challenges. When I was offered to become a partner in this project, I realized that this was an opportunity not just to make money, but to make an impact on the industry I knew so well. This project was about new technology in the hospitality industry, and I knew this was something that could greatly improve my work. I didn't hesitate. My confidence was at its peak, and I knew I could handle it. I spoke to the team, presented the idea, and got their support. It was a real moment of freedom and growth. I was no longer looking for excuses. I was looking for opportunities, and I now felt like the future belonged to me. In that moment, I also realized how much my relationship with people had changed. I was no longer trying to please those around me or work to other people's expectations. I was doing what I thought was right, and people were beginning to understand that. I was no longer looking for other people's views on my life, on my work. I became me, a strong woman who didn't depend on the opinions of others. My career, my life, my relationships all became a part of me. I couldn't let anyone from the outside influence me again. I decided to take full control and move toward new opportunities. Even though old memories came up for me along the way, I was ready to put them behind me. I thought about the future, and it was full, clear, and bright. When I first stood on this new road, it seemed like everything around me was just beginning to blossom. It wasn't just a new phase in my life, it was a true discovery. I was no longer trying to be someone who was trying to please or prove something. I realized that my whole strength was not in controlling everyone around me, but in learning to control myself, in being myself and not being afraid of it. Every morning I woke up feeling light, as if I had thrown off the shackles that held me back in the past. I didn't think about what had gone before anymore. I didn't worry about how my relationship with Ethan would end. It was an ending, but not a finale, but the beginning of a new chapter. Everything I had experienced was now a lesson that I applied to become a better, stronger, and independent person. I immersed myself in new projects, and everything I created was now becoming part of my destiny. Every day I became more confident that I could do what I wanted to do. The resort I was managing became a real success. And even though I was doing everything I could to stay focused on my work, I felt things were working out in my favor. I couldn't stop now, and I wasn't going to. I was just savoring the moments that brought me joy and satisfaction in my accomplishments. One day, as I was going through my reports, I suddenly got a text message. I saw his name, Ethan. It was so unexpected that I felt slightly dizzy. He was trying to come into my life again, and I realized that despite his best efforts, he was still hoping for some kind of comeback. He wrote that he wanted to talk, that his life had changed, and he realized how much he had lost. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. He was trying the old techniques again, trying to make me feel guilty again. I read his message and thought that I didn't want to go through all the emotions I had once felt again. I realized that my life was now for me. I was no longer looking for comfort or permission from anyone to move forward. I was answering to myself, and only myself. Ethan continued to write. He said he would always regret losing me. He talked about how hard it was for him without me, how he realized all his mistakes. But I knew it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for excuses for his actions. I didn't want to go back to the place where he was the center of my life. I was no longer the woman who was trying to get back into a relationship that had long since faded into the past. At some point, after a couple days, as his messages became more and more persistent, I decided to make a decision. I wasn't going to put this moment off any longer. I wasn't going to let his regrets take away my attention. I accepted the fact that everything that had happened no longer mattered. I wasn't going to waste my life worrying about something that wouldn't change anything. He had already made his choice, and I had made mine. My future was in my hands. I looked back at my path again. All that pain, all that path I'd traveled, all that I'd lost. It was now a part of me, and I didn't want to stop. I knew that now I would move forward. I answered his messages, but only to clearly say, I'm not going back. I've already moved on. And while I didn't feel angry with him, I felt like I didn't have to be a part of it anymore. I didn't wait for his forgiveness. I didn't need validation for my decisions. My life was now pointed toward new horizons, and I wasn't letting old memories ruin it. I learned to let go. It wasn't easy, but it was essential to my growth. A few days after I finally closed the door on our past, I realized that I felt no regret or pain. In that moment, I realized that I was truly set free. I wasn't waiting for an apology or a confession. I had made a decision and stepped into a new life. I felt that inner light that had been extinguished for so long begin to burn within me again. My life took on a new meaning, and I no longer let my past dictate to me what I should be. I met new challenges with confidence. There was no longer any falseness in what I was doing. Everything was sincere. I wasn't trying to please anyone but myself. I taught myself to appreciate what I had and enjoy what came into my life. Work, which before was just a way to distract myself from the pain, was now my truth and purpose. I found my voice again, my power. At one point, I was offered an expansion of my business. I was asked to create a chain of resorts and hotels around the world, and the idea seemed absolutely real and possible. I knew it was a chance that couldn't be missed. It wasn't just an offer. It was a chance to show everyone and myself that I was capable of not only managing one project, but turning it into something bigger. But before I made my decision, I asked myself the question, what is more important to me? And I answered that what was more important was what I could create. That was my life, my rules. I started working on a new project, and with each step I felt myself becoming even more confident. Ethan and his attempts to come back into my life became something distant. I didn't even think about him. Everything that was happening in my life was the result of my own efforts, and I was proud of that. I had everything I needed to be happy: a job, self-actualization, self-confidence, and all of this without looking back. When I finished another project, when all the stars aligned and everything started to develop the way I wanted it to, I realized that I had come to an important conclusion. I no longer depended on who would be around me. I had learned to be happy alone because I had found meaning in myself. It was a moment of realization. I didn't need anyone else's validation or approval. I was my own support. Once I was fully established in my business and on the personal front, I felt incredibly calm. I wasn't looking for revenge or recognition. Everything that had happened and everything I had experienced was now a lesson to me. I learned to appreciate every moment, and even when old memories tried to bring me back to my old state, I remembered my power and how far I had come. I didn't try to change things anymore. I learned to let go and realized that nothing in this life could be taken back. I no longer tried to find answers to questions that once seemed important. One day, as I stood on the balcony of my new home, looking out at the ocean, I realized that I no longer had anything holding me to the past. I was free from regrets, from people, from situations that had once fettered my soul. And though I still caught myself thinking about him sometimes, I no longer felt the pain. Everything was as it should be. I knew that my life now depended solely on me. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. I no longer needed the past to justify my actions, to explain my decisions. I simply became a woman who accepted my life for what it was. I was no longer trying to be someone else, no longer seeking other people's approval, no longer waiting for change. I was on my own path, and I didn't need validation that this path was the right one. I already knew it was the right one. And so, after a while, as I was driving down the road in a new city, I felt the world around me fill with light again. And while I wasn't looking for happiness in other people, I realized that it comes when you finally start listening to yourself. And that's when it comes, crashing down on you like a stream of light. I was ready for it. And while I still didn't know what I would do tomorrow, I was sure of one thing. I would do it with the confidence and determination I had been searching for so long. This was my path, and I wasn't going to stop.